Again, welcome to receiving phone calls from incarcerated survivors. This web conference was developed as a tool for all the California Advancing PREA participants as the new flyers, yay, and access to phone calls in all CDCR facilities are beginning to go live, and you've probably been receiving a few of those calls yourself as well. I am Juliana Baez, Training and Technical Assistance Specialist for the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CALCASA, and I would like to welcome Chris Mady and Matthew Van Winkle, both officers at Just Detention International, or JDI, who I will be co-presenting with today.
Thank you, Juliana, and welcome everyone. Just Detention International, or JDI for short, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention. It's JDI's belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. Juliana?
Thank you, Chris. The California Coalition Against Sexual Assault is committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. We provide leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. And at CALCASA, we envision a world free from sexual violence. Now in its fourth year, the California Office of Emergency Services has funded the California Advancing PREA project, which allows CALCASA and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to the California Rape Crisis Centers on how to build strong relationships with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, with their staff, and also to create sustainable agreements and protocols for the provision of victim services to survivors. Earlier in the project, the California Advancing PREA team focused on fundamental culture change on both the corrections and the advocacy side. Over time, we've put many MOUs in place between CDCR facilities and their local RCCs, and we've provided technical training and assistance whenever it's needed. Although much progress has been made, we understand that there continues to be a gap and challenges in the services available to survivors behind bars. At this time, I invite all participants to share with us what agency you join us from and what facility or facilities you are providing services to. We always like to hear a little bit more about those who are with us. Today's presentation has 3 sections. Effectively, these sections could be thought of in terms of 3 action verbs: preparing, doing, and sustaining. We'll begin with thoughts on how to make your agency more ready to provide over-the-phone support to incarcerated survivors, continue with some things to be mindful of during calls, and closing with ways to make sure that your program of providing emotional support by phone can continue beyond the possible life of this project or any staff turnover as you've probably experienced before. As always, we encourage you to please practice self-care during this webinar. Take a few deep breaths, step outside if needed, stand up and stretch, any activity that's going to help you be more aware of yourself and take care of yourself. We've also emailed some coloring pages. We encourage you to doodle or color as you are listening to the webinar as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juliana. This is Matthew Van Winkle with Just Detention International. We're very happy to be presenting for you all today on this very important topic. I want to mention here at the top that we should really be mindful about the term hotline. Inside facilities, the term PREA hotline refers to a number that inmates call to make a report and not to receive confidential emotional support services. So what we're going to focus on today is providing the confidential emotional support services, not anything to do with reports or investigations of reports. It's just kind of an important term and a distinction to keep in mind that a word that means one thing to us means a different thing inside. Next slide, please. So posters like these two are featuring your agency's logo, phone number, and address, like the ones on this slide, will soon be posted in housing areas at your local CDCR site, letting all who see them know that free and confidential calls will now be facilitated between incarcerated survivors in CDCR facilities and your agency. You've likely heard us talk about this before, in trainings, in our monthly newsletter, and basically at every opportunity we can. This change represents a big win for all of us who are involved in this project. In the past, calls from CDCR sites were monitored or recorded. They will now be unmonitored and unrecorded. This new CDCR policy to facilitating calls is a huge step forward in helping survivors who are incarcerated receive emotional support and care closer to the level of confidential care that someone else in the community might be able to get. Some of you have perhaps even received test calls from inside the CDCR facilities confirming that the number listed for your agency on the poster is correct and that the phone system is allowing outbound calls to be made to your number. Making sure that the posters are posted is a great excuse, by the way, to reach out to the PREA staff at your facility. Many of you already have MOUs in place with them, which include contact sheets called Exhibit A's, giving a list of contact numbers. If you can't lay hands on that document, you can always check the CDCR website, cdcr.ca.gov, for information on how to reach that facility by phone, or please reach out to one of us on the California Advancing PREA team. We'll be able to put you in touch with the proper staff at the facility. And I know I speak for the entire team when I say we love to hear from you. Next slide, please. So it will be important to make sure that all who may be answering the numbers shared on the poster are aware of the change to confidential, unrecorded calls. And are trained that although for the most part providing telephone crisis intervention to someone who's incarcerated calls on the same skill set you would use for any other caller, there are a few ways in which the dynamics of calls from inside facilities will be different, which Chris will be getting into a bit later in today's presentation. It's possible that many of your agencies use an answering service for incoming hotline calls. It will be useful to take a few minutes to revisit their script and make sure that it includes questions about a person's physical safety and location. It will be a good idea to make sure the answering service that fields the calls has a good way of passing along information, such as whether the call has come from inside a facility, to your staff prior to transferring the call over, which will allow you to focus more on providing services once you get on the line. It's good to make sure that the questions being asked during intake are appropriate for all possible callers, including those who might be calling from inside facilities. If you haven't taken a look at the scripts recently, this might be a good time to do so, rather than making adjustments once calls from CDCR sites begin to come through. And it's going to be important that both leadership staff and advocates of your agency are all on the same page. We hope that most of your colleagues who might be answering such calls are with us today on this web conference. But if they're not, please pass along what you've learned. Pass along the recording of the webinar, which Juliana will send out today or tomorrow, so they have a chance to understand the changes that will affect their work. You might also devote some time to this topic at the next staff meeting or call team meeting. Getting managers and advocates on the same page now will help ensure that you have time for any needed discussions or to develop internal protocols prior to the rollout. Printing and hanging a copy of the flyer, which will be seen at CDCR sites in your own office, is a good idea to help everyone stay mindful of this change. So here's what to expect. When calls come in from the CDCR site, some may be preceded by an announcement to the effect that the call is originating from a state prison, but some may not. We've heard of several test calls to agencies, and we've learned that the announcement is not always played at the top of the call. So it's useful, of course, to know whether or not the call is coming from a CDCR facility for two reasons. First, you want to be able to report on your services to survivors held in CDCR sites, and much more importantly, so that you can make sure to provide appropriate recommendations and advocacy for that survivor. The fact that you may receive an announcement that the call is from inside a facility does not mean that the call is collect, by the way. It should be answered like any other crisis call. Unless there's a specific statement that the call is collected, do not treat it as a collect call. The calls will be automatically cut off after 15 minutes. So that's a little bit of a narrow window. CDCR has confirmed that there will be some kind of a warning signal when time is running down, but it might be useful to make note of the time a call starts as well so that you can pace it appropriately. Of course, also remind them that they can call back at any time they feel safe to do so. Inmates will have access to the phones mostly between the hours of 7 in the morning and 9 in the evening. And also, while the calls are confidential, the environment in which the caller is standing may not be private. But they're the experts on what is safe for them, and they made the determination to call you when they did. But they might see the need to stay safe by abruptly falling silent, changing the topic, or hanging up. And certainly, don't take that personally, as of course you wouldn't. Next slide, please. So I mentioned intake forms before on the slide with the cute ducks. But let's take a closer look now at some of the modifications that might help make them more inclusive and help with your record keeping for providing follow-up services. Collecting certain pieces of information from survivors phoning from inside CDCR sites, such as name, their CDCR number, their housing unit. That's something that we hope can happen during every call received. As with all calls that come in, of course, the person on the other end has made the choice to call at this moment, so they need help. Their focus and ours is properly on their needs. But we want to make sure there are some spaces on the client intake forms to indicate if someone's incarcerated, what facility they're housed at, and where at the facility they're housed, what their full legal name is, and what the caller's CDCR number is. We use CDCR numbers quite a bit when we're providing resources and referrals to your agency to make sure that someone is still housed in the CDCR site that their letter came from. And the CDCR website is updated daily with information about transfers and moves. It's very easy to use that. Just type in that number that begins with a letter. So all this information you've collected, it's going to be needed to provide follow-up for a survivor via mail. Of course, calls at this point are only one way. They can call you, you can't call them. And we do plan to provide some additional TA around written correspondence later on this year. But I should mention that CDCR has agreed previously, I guess our previous big win for this project, is that CDCR agreed to treat correspondence between inmates and advocates at the RCC they have an MOU with as legal mail when Evidentiary Code 1035.4 is printed on the envelope. So mail is a really great way to provide confidential follow-up support. Next slide, please. Over the course of this project, we've often spoken about the foundational importance of taking a tour of your facility. And now that you'll be in even more frequent contact with clients at CDCR sites, agency knowledge of the facility is going to come to help you even more. Every CDCR prison is different in terms of layout, available programming, and security level. And of course, there are multiple housing classifications inside any given facility, which has a big impact on what someone's life looks like day to day. We'll get into that a bit later. Those of you who have had the chance to tour the CDCR site or sites in your area might have a more clear sense of what things are like inside. And in particular, it's useful to know about the different security levels and the differences between dorms, pods, and ADSEG. If it's been a year or more since your last tour, then it's probably time to think about taking another one. And this time the tour could be focused on ensuring hotline access, making sure the posters are up, and building a list of resources for yourself, knowledge of what is available in the prison that you can refer folks to. Remember, you can ask to see specific places inside, such as where the phones are, where programming takes place, etc. You can ask to meet with programming leaders, teachers, chaplains, etc., and maybe schedule meetings to see how they can work together as trauma-informed resources for survivors housed there. When you take your tour, bring plenty of business cards and hand them out, and take as many cards from the staff and volunteers you meet as you can. Touring a facility can often take the better part of a day, of course, including travel, so definitely use it as an opportunity to maximize your time and build more connections. Meeting with the Inmate Advisory Council is also highly recommended, as these will be the folks most familiar with the culture in place at the prison and how best to talk about your services with them. Now, you should maintain a resource list. What kinds of access do inmates housed at different levels of the facility have to programming, such as mindfulness or yoga classes? Are there electronic kiosks in the housing unit that can be used for research on the Prison Rape Elimination Act or other topics? Is there a prison library? If there are certain books you feel would be of use to survivors, you should contact the prison and see if copies of the books can be donated or ordered for the library. Next slide, please. So housing makes a difference. When we discuss questions to include on your intake form, we mentioned that it's wise to ask a survivor who is incarcerated where in the prison they're housed. Housing makes a difference. Advice like take a walk or watch the sunset might be very helpful advice for someone who needs to process trauma. But for a traumatized person who is incarcerated, before we offer any such advice, it's good to know just how much access they have to the outdoors. Is there a yard in the open air where they might be able to clear their thoughts and exercise? Inmates in the general population have access to a yard under the sky. But those living in the SHU, or ADSEG, which is sometimes referred to as jail, or the jail in the jail by inmates, have to take their exercise in a walled concrete pen the size of a large dog run, as seen in the photo on the right. Big difference. Also, if someone is in segregated housing, they may not be passing by areas where the posters giving your agency information are visible. This can be another topic to raise with allies you've found among the prison staff, ensuring that an effort is made for all people held at the facility to be educated on the resources for healing that are now available. So if they're not going by an area where the posters are hung, maybe talk to your allies about having smaller copies of the posters printed out for individual distribution, those held in the SHU or ADSEG. Next slide, please. So the final piece in preparing is to reach out to the facility and let them know we're ready to help you. You should contact your allies inside the facility and let them know you're aware of the upcoming change to confidential non-recorded calls and that you're ready. You should take the chance to make sure that they've received a copy of the poster from headquarters and confirm that copies have been placed where all people held at the facility can read them, regardless of housing. Request that they make a test call. This is very important. Request that they make a test call of your number from inside the housing units to make sure it works and to make sure you know how those calls come through. Letting them know what you've done so far on your end to prepare will help build trust and show you as both professional and proactive, which of course you are. And finally, remind them that you're an ongoing resource and that your services are also offered to them, their colleagues, and their families in the community. Always give them an upcoming meeting, a fundraiser, or other event in which they can participate. And if you see that a particular PREA compliance manager or other staff is doing exceptional work to help facilitate access to your services, perhaps there's a way to recognize that person publicly. We've seen cases of agencies giving out awards to staff who go above and beyond, and that all helps forge stronger bonds between corrections staff and your agencies. And at the end of the day, that benefits survivors, the ones who need you to be in good partnership. Chris?
Thank you, Matthew. So now that you've done your research and you have an idea about the logistics of these calls, we can start thinking about some of the most common types of calls that rape crisis centers tend to get from correctional facilities. And so we're going to explore some good practices, a lot of which mirror what you're already doing in the community for folks on your crisis line. Although it can take a little while for people to trust your agency and the services that you're offering, it might be that it takes a little bit of time for folks to really use the phone to their full potential. But we know that that is a possibility, and we're excited to have this get off the ground. So a good place to start a call is by stating who you are and reiterating what your agency is for. So for example, this is a line for survivors of sexual abuse and their loved ones. If possible, you want to determine upfront what specific facility the person is calling from, so that way you can give them accurate resources and referrals. You can do this by saying, "Do you mind if I ask where you're calling from so I can make sure to give you information that best fits where you are?" It can be a little bit awkward to try to determine this, but we really need to know this so that way we can give the proper information. And once you're able to determine that that person is calling from a CDCR facility, it can be helpful to let that person know that the call might be cut off after a few minutes, like Matthew mentioned, but that they can call back if they feel safe doing so. You also might want to clarify that the call is non-recorded and confidential, but also you want to make sure that folks know the limits of your confidentiality so that if they disclose threat of harm to themselves or others, that you would have to share that information. Calls where survivors are seeking general emotional support are some of the most common calls that rape crisis centers tend to get from incarcerated survivors, as well as from other survivors in the community. When people are calling for general emotional support, we can use the same skills that we use with folks in the community. First and foremost, we want to remind survivors that it's not their fault that the assault happened. Sexual assault can be an incredibly isolating experience, and that is especially true for survivors who are in prison. In prison, talking about sexual abuse is not welcome and is often dangerous, which is why having these confidential calls is so needed. As advocates, we have the ability to reiterate that the caller is not alone and that healing is possible. You might be the first person that this caller has opened up to about their assault. We can normalize trauma reactions while being mindful that the prison environment can be extremely triggering, as things like strip searches and the hyper-controlled environment may heighten someone's reactions post-assault. We can also offer coping skills, and we need to make sure that these skills that we're offering can be used inside a detention setting. It can always be great to ask upfront what the survivor has access to, as it will depend on the individual prison and the survivor's housing, what resources they might be able to access. As a general rule, coping skills that require little to no materials and can be done without attracting attention of others tend to be the most applicable in a detention setting. These can include things like progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness techniques, and journaling. Things like mindfulness and breathing techniques are more commonplace for folks in the community, but for folks who have been incarcerated for some time, they may have no idea what these things could look like, and I always offer to walk the person through these activities so that they can get an understanding on how to do it alone when they're not on the phone together. As a supplement to these good suggestions you and your colleagues are already aware of and are helping your clients with, we will be sending a PDF of self-care tips that can be done by anyone, anywhere. And these lists of self-care tips were created by an inmate at the California Institution for Women. We'll attach it in our email follow-up to this presentation. So I suggest that you all take a look at that, as it's a really wonderful resource. You can also provide resources within the facility, and this is where your research can come in handy, so you know what kind of mental health support or other programming is available to that survivor. Survivors who are incarcerated know themselves and their resources best. They are a wealth of knowledge, so even when we're not sure how to help someone, we can help them process through and talk out what they're experiencing. Another type of call you may get is someone who is calling where they are describing abuse that is ongoing. For these calls, we provide general emotional support with the added component of safety planning. In this safety plan, we want to help the person think through ways that they would feel safest, keeping in mind that retaliation is very real and reporting might not be a solid option for them. If they're thinking about reporting, we can help them walk through this process and talk through what it might look like if they did make a report. And if they still feel like that's what they would like to do, I generally ask them if there is any staff that they feel particularly comfortable talking with, and have them start the report with that person. If there is no staff that they trust and they still want to report, that you can refer them to the PREA hotline that we were talking about at the beginning of this webinar. As in the community, survivors might choose to keep the abuse to themselves, and you might have to end the call knowing that they're going back to an abusive situation. But we have to believe that the survivor knows what is best for themselves, and we can always remind them to call us or write us to continue to receive support. Sometimes callers will talk to us who have made a PREA report and are very frustrated with the process of an investigation, still feel unsafe, or are devastated that their case was determined to be unfounded. When we get these calls, we can echo what we do in the community if someone has made a police report and is experiencing issues around the criminal justice process. First and foremost, we want to start with providing emotional support, which will often hold a strong component of validating someone's frustration with the system. We know that the reporting process isn't perfect and that frequently things are not investigated at a level which we would like, and it's okay to voice that sentiment to a client. Even if we have built a wonderful relationship with our CDCR staff and facility, we want to make sure we're not defending staff to the survivor. If the survivor is disclosing issues with the system or an officer, we want to reflect back that what is happening to them is not okay. Sometimes we can help a survivor explore other avenues of reporting or receiving assistance. This often has to be creative, as the survivor will have likely tried most of the general options. Depending on your agency's policies, you may also be able to offer advocacy to the survivor in offering to assist them in the process. For example, you might be able to call the PCM on their behalf, or you may be able to be present during interviews with investigators. If you are able to offer advocacy, we want to make sure we're not making promises that we can't keep or don't have control over. So we don't want to promise that we can get someone's housing changed or that their investigation is going to go forward. We don't want to make promises we can't keep. That being said, we want to make sure we're as honest as possible that our advocacy may bring unwanted attention and that the survivor could experience retaliation as a result. When someone's calling about their PREA report, we want to make sure that we have a strong understanding of the tenets of PREA and someone's rights so that we can explain them to a survivor. And we want to feel prepared and knowledgeable about the facility so we can help a survivor navigate this difficult process. One of the most common fears that advocates have when answering a support line is talking to a client who is suicidal. And while these calls can be scary, folks who are calling a support line are calling for a reason. And we want to make sure that we know that and that we are working with them to create a plan for safety. We know that while suicidal calls are rare, we want you to feel prepared. So as when we get calls in the community where someone is disclosing that they have a plan to harm themselves or others, we want to closely follow our agency's protocols and procedures regarding assessment and reporting to authorities. So make sure you know your agency's protocol regarding suicide so that you can adapt it for calls that come from correctional facilities. When we receive a disclosure from a client, we want to remind the person that the calls are confidential unless they disclose a plan to harm themselves or others, and that you will have to report that information. If the caller refuses or is unable to agree to a plan to keep themselves safe, and you have used your agency's protocol to assess that confidentiality needs to be broken in order to keep the caller safe, a call needs to be made to a correctional facility. This call can be made to a number of different people. So if you have an MOU with your facility, Exhibit A includes phone numbers to the PCM and ISU that you can call to make this report. But you always want to make sure that those phone numbers are up to date. If they are not available, all institutions have a 24-hour watch commander that you can contact. Their information can be found on the CDCR website. It can be helpful to make sure that these numbers are easily accessible so that if they're needed, you're not scrambling to find that number. Once you contact CDCR staff about a client, CDCR will then refer to mental health, and mental health will interview that person and may put that person under observation or suicide watch. Suicide watch in the CDCR facilities ranges from 15-minute checks to removal from a cell depending on the risk that is determined during the assessment. After you've contacted CDCR about the disclosure, you would want to follow up with the facility to see what steps they have taken so you know how to proceed in terms of following up with the client and also to ensure that the client is as safe as possible. Again, we know these calls can be very stressful, and we encourage you to check in with other staff at your agency when you get them. When we're working on a support line, we can expect to receive calls that are off topic and are sometimes inappropriate. The same is true when we start to receive calls from folks in detention. We want to be mindful that someone may not disclose sexual abuse right away on the phone, as phones are often in public places, And just because someone doesn't directly say that they are a survivor does not mean that they're intentionally misusing the hotline. That being said, what we can do if someone isn't bringing up sexual abuse or sexual harassment is reminding the caller about the purpose of the hotline. You can always ask them if that's why they're calling today. You can also offer to go over some coping skills. If the caller still remains off topic, remind them again what the call is for and let them know that they can call back if they have any concerns in regards to sexual abuse or sexual harassment, and then you can end the call. We also might get calls that are inappropriate, where a caller is using degrading language or is trying to seek sexual gratification by calling. If you're feeling like a caller is being inappropriate, make sure you set boundaries as soon as you can. It's okay to interrupt someone and say something like, "I'm not comfortable with the language that you're using. Can you focus more on how you're feeling?" A caller might just be testing to see if you're a safe person to talk to or has never really had someone to set boundaries for them. So once those boundaries are stated, if the client can agree to follow them, you can proceed with the call as you would with someone in the community. But if a client refuses to stick to the boundaries or continues to be inappropriate, you can end that call. I usually say something like, "As you're not able to respect my boundaries right now, I'm going to have to end this call," and you don't have to wait for a response to hang up. It can be very frustrating to get an off-topic or inappropriate call, but just like when we get them from folks in the community, we want to be as professional and clear as possible. It can also be helpful to check in with your team when you get calls like this. So now that we've gone over how to start a call and the different types of calls that you may receive, we want to review how to wrap that call up. So when we're ending a call, we want to always summarize what we spoke to the client about and review any relevant safety plans we may have made. We also want to offer follow-up, which will likely look very different than it would for someone in the community, as Matthew mentioned. As we cannot just call someone up who is incarcerated, a follow-up plan might be having a survivor call the support line back, or it might include letter writing or in-person services, depending on what your agency provides. Letter correspondence is the easiest way to provide follow-up to an incarcerated survivor, and on the call you can give the survivor your agency's mailing address to write to you, or you can offer to send them a letter. You can ask, "Would you like us to follow up with you through mail?" If they say yes, let them know that you need their information so that it gets to them. To send a piece of mail to a CDCR inmate, you're going to need their full legal name, their CDCR number, housing unit, and facility address. If they're going to send you a letter, make sure to remind them to use evidence code 1035.4 to keep that correspondence confidential. If you will be providing in-person services, make sure you get their permission to set that up and make sure to be as realistic as possible about the timing around that. If you've offered to assist with advocacy, make sure you follow your agency's guidelines on contacting someone on their behalf. Do you need written consent? If so, make sure to check in about mailing that to them. If verbal consent works with your agency, make sure to document that. You will also want to plan for how you're going to let the survivor know what happened in your advocacy efforts and update them. It can be difficult to fit this all into a time-limited phone call, but know that the survivor does have your information and can always call your support line back. And while it can be stressful to start these calls, know just by listening to a survivor and being a safe person to talk to, you're offering something that that survivor may have never had access to before, and that you are making a difference. Juliana?
Thank you, Chris. And as crisis-wise services, we know that these can be vital. They can be a vital way for supporting survivors, and it's one of those things where they connect immediately with you. So now let's discuss next steps to creating sustainability of these services. Changing systems is just the beginning of the work that we've been doing inside detention. And an important aspect of providing services to survivors is to continue the work. We encourage you to periodically test the lines from your facility. Keeping all contact information up to date is crucial for consistency of services. Make sure to check in with your contact regularly for updated information. We want to make sure we create a sustainable service and understand that some survivors are not ready to disclose now. We want to make sure that when they are, we as RCCs are ready and that they have access to these services. Make PREA and your services a constant topic of conversation with the facility and your own agency. keeping an open conversation of trends, needs, and other items can be helpful, can help the facility and identify their needs, and helps us really make a shift for survivors behind bars. Not only do we need to have these conversations with our facility, it's best practice to continue the conversations of the needs of access for survivors behind bars with your RCC staff. We want to ensure that all staff has the basic skills of what is happening inside detention and can support one another. We'll talk a little bit more about self-care on the following slides, but keeping these services as a constant topic will help in creating sustainability. As we've done through this project, we need to report on the services we're providing. There is a section devoted specifically to hotline calls that come in the reporting on the reporting form that you submit to us on a monthly basis. The data that you collect during these calls can be used to help identify trends and needs inside the facilities, especially data coming directly from victim services. As you begin to hear specific officers being named over and over, the type of any members of a specific demographic group targeted with more frequency, you can help identify the needs of training inside these facilities and bring these topics to your connections inside. They might not look the same from facility to facility though, so be aware that the dynamics are different from side to side, and you will learn your dynamics from correction to correction as you begin to do a little bit more work and so you build more of a strong rapport with them as well. And what are you doing with this information? That's an important question. The data that you collect can help guide conversations with your facilities on the need of specific training. The training could benefit the safety of your facility and help identify communities of needs within your community as well. Your facility is part of your community, and therefore it impacts the work that you do. And just a friendly reminder that progress reports are due on the 10th of each month or on the next business day if the 10th lands on a holiday or a weekend. And these progress reports help us, the California Advancing PREA team, understand a little bit more of the services that are being given and the need for additional training or additional system advocacy that needs to be done from our end. And we know that the road to ending sexual violence is a long one. One of our main goals this year is to create a system in which sustainability is possible. There is no benefit in changing and implementing amazing resources and tools if the work is not sustainable and is draining for your agency. Staff self-care tends to be put on the back end, but it's very much needed. This work can feel a bit isolated. In creating a space for check-ins, it's much needed. As advocates, we learned that there are some survivors we can reach and others we can't. This is similar in detention, with the exception that you know where they are and can't really do anything about it. We have to be fine with our limitations when working with incarcerated survivors. There are going to be times where you're only going to be a listener and can't provide many resources. The data that you will have access can help develop an open line with CDCR of needs identified, which can be the only way that you can support survivors. It is also important to keep these lines of communication consistent. Consistency is an important part of your work for building relationships with survivors and the systems you're working with. Ongoing training for your agency and the facility also helps with sustainability. Training of facility and RCC staff helps in creating a sustainable and reliable program. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but we've used the word consistency and sustainability a lot, and we feel that when we are consistent with our services and with the line of communication, as much as it can be a little frustrated at the beginning, it definitely has or creates a shift. Here is a quote from Frank Mendoza, who is a prisoner rape survivor and member of JDI Survival Council. He shares, "If I had an advocate, it would have saved me so much grief. It would have helped me through the traumatic event immensely. Going through it alone, I did not know who I trust and who I could talk to about it, which appeared to be nobody." Now, all the information presented today is crucial in ensuring successful advocacy in detention. Here are some highlights from today's presentation. So make sure you have an opportunity to test call from do test calls from inmate phones. That's important. Make sure that you're doing it from the phones that inmates are going to have access to. You will be prepared to support survivors at your facility, and you know what to expect. Check your facility's posters, the numbers, address, location of the posters. We want to make sure that all survivors have access to the correct information and that they are being posted in key locations. Maintain a list of resources available at the facility that you can direct survivors there to. Look into ways of healing. Identify the training needs for facility staff and agency volunteers. Support survivors on the crisis line the same way that you would support someone in the community, keeping in mind your limitations. Track and report data to ensure that all needs are being met. Ensure sustainability with consistency of services. Self-care awareness, and keeping in mind your agency's capacity. Don't promise what you can't realistically provide. So here, we've provided a lot of information. What to do before, what to do during, and what to do after. Again, if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box or reach out to us individually so that we can support you with those. We also want to remind everyone of upcoming events for the California Advancing PREA team. We will be facilitating a training for the Mid-Coast Region cohort. The training will focus on trans survivors behind bars and human trafficking conversations from behind bars. So we look forward to seeing you there, and I know some of you have already participated in past region trainings. And we are now sold out, but we will be hosting the National Sexual Assault Conference from August 28th to the 31st in Anaheim, California. JDI will be hosting a few pre-conference events with guest speakers and panels, so keep an eye on those as well. You can always reach us individually through our emails, or the entire team can respond to questions sent through advocate@justdetention.org or at PREA@CALCASA.org. Please, again, feel free to email us, call us, whatever you need to do to ask for support, or just to let us know how things are going in the facilities and if you're having any challenges with the flyers or the new activated phone. And there are a lot of answers to a lot of your questions at the JDI and CALCASA website. We have the online modules, we have archived webinars as well, but our to-go place is definitely the PREA Resource Center. They have a lot of tools that support those who are doing work in detention. We welcome you to visit them as well. They're our to-go place. At this time, we have some time for some questions or comments or thoughts. Please feel free to type them in the chat box if you have any. And if you don't, it's okay. We definitely feel like we've been able to keep in touch a little bit more with our RCCs this time around. So I'm hoping that a lot of your questions are being answered. But again, we encourage you to let us know how your testing of the lines are going, if you have a chance to go on a tour of your facility and see where the flyers are being placed, if you see any discrepancies or if you see something that just doesn't make sense on the flyers, please let us know. We are collecting that information, and we, it's a new rollout right now, and we are making sure that everything is being done and double-checked and finalized. So if you see anything that needs to be updated, please let us know. Like I said, we're collecting that information so that we can make the necessary changes and adaptations to the flyers or the calls or whatever it might be. If there's no questions, we would just like to thank you very much for being part of our web conference today. We hope that you took some information and that this information is helpful in preparing your agency to respond to these calls. We hope to see an increase of calls just because, now survivors are going to have access to a free form of advocacy when before it was a little bit more challenging. So please don't hesitate to ever call or email or whatever it might be to ask for support. Again, let us know how things are going, and we really do appreciate all the amazing work that you all are doing when it comes to providing services to survivors behind bars. So thank you very much. If there's no questions or comments, enjoy your beautiful day today. Hopefully everyone's keeping cool, and we are very proud and honored to be part of this project with you all. Thank you so much.